Now, turning to the main event, I would like to introduce Dr. Katy Long, who joins us here from the California Migration Museum. Now, I think Dr. Long will be familiar with many of us in the forced migration field, given her exemplary scholarship, particularly her work on mobility and solutions. Her scholarship includes the incredibly influential book, The Point of No Return, Refugees' Rights and Repatriation, numerous journal publications, and of course her editorship of the Oxford Handbook of Refugee and Forced Migration Studies. Dr. Long has held faculty positions at the Universities of Oxford, LSE, and Edinburgh, as well as a visiting fellowship at Stanford. She has worked on a range of projects with organisations including the UNHCR, the International Labour Organization, World Bank, and the Migration Policy Institute. She was inaugural module developer and convener of the MA programme's Forced Migration Studies core module, and was really instrumental in those first years when we were developing the programme. And many of her ideas remain core to the module content to this day. In addition to a prolific academic and teaching career, Dr. Long's skill and passion, I would say, has been public engagement. She's reported on refugee issues in outlets such as BBC Radio 4, The Guardian, and The Washington Post. And of course, this is central to her work at the California Migration Museum, which she founded in 2022 and now directs. Her talk today, Breaking Through the Wall, Taking Forced Migration Research Outside the Academy, is, I think, a very pertinent opportunity to reflect on how we, as academics and practitioners in the forced migration field, can effectively engage with those outside of our quote-unquote bubble and help to counter some of the increasingly hostile rhetoric we're seeing today across so much of the globe. Thank you so much, Katy, for joining us today. Following the talk, we will hopefully be having some time for questions and discussion, so please do store up any questions you would like to pose. But I hand over now to Dr. Katy Long.
Okay, thank you so much, Sarah. So, in the next 30 minutes, I want to tell you a story. And it's a story about why I think forced migration research matters, at least as much, and perhaps even more so than it has ever done. But it's also a story about what the limits of forced migration research are. What can it possibly hope to do if it remains trapped in lecture halls or scholarly journals? It's a story as well about why over the past decade, I've personally chosen to move further and further away from what you might call traditional academia. So 10 years ago, when I started teaching the Refugee Law Initiative's first cohort of MA students, millions of refugees were pouring out of Syria. And their exodus, of course, as we know, triggered a pan-European crisis and tested international commitment to asylum, arguably past breaking point, as those refugees walked west in search of sanctuary, and with a few honorable exceptions, the West looked to offload its responsibilities someplace else. The need for new solutions, for something to break the impasse, was both urgent and obvious. And there were plenty of good ideas in the conference rooms I sat in over the next year or so, as various actors tried to thrash out what a new global compact might look like. But the actions that followed were limited. And for me, the many failures of the international community to do much more than talk while children drowned on Turkish beaches wasn't just tragic, was also revealing. Because as much as I didn't want it to be true, I knew that the officials who shrugged their shoulders and said, yeah, nice idea, but there's no political will, weren't wrong. And the ensuing decade has provided plenty of proof points for that, plenty of proof points for those who want to argue that at a national level, voters don't want immigration and voters don't like refugees and asylum seekers. There's Brexit, there's Trump's two election victories, there's the rise of the AfD in Germany and the National Rally in France, as well as similar anti-immigrant movements in countries from India to Italy. Right now, There are border walls being built across 5 continents. But still, back in 2015, back in those conference rooms full of like-minded people, the realization that nothing much was ever going to change here, even as I and many other colleagues wrote research papers and made policy recommendations on repeat, was dispiriting. Increasingly, I found myself listening to an internal, looping monologue, constantly asking the question, yeah, what exactly is the point? So spoiler alert, I do think there is a point. I do think that forced migration research is critical, even more so when the fires of chaos are burning quite as hot as they are right now in so many parts of the world. But I also think for research like this to really matter, it needs to find ways to move beyond the academy. And I think it's especially important we think creatively about how to take it outside these walls and into the public spaces where right now the value of research itself is under attack. Never mind opposition to such crazy ideas as asylum or due process. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because what I realized sometime after 2015 was that for me, the structure of academic research felt increasingly at odds with the motivations that had led me into that forced migration research in the first place. I started my work because I wanted to understand things better so that I could change things for the better. Now, this isn't especially unusual. When it comes to forced migration research, activism has been there since the beginning. You think about activist, scholar, and research figures like Barbara Harrell-Bond. They've been key in not only establishing refugee studies programs across the globe, but also, at the same time, arguing in favor of refugee rights and holding governments to account. But there are many tensions in that model. How do you maintain a degree of objectivity as a researcher if the work is driven by a political agenda? How do you ensure you're not taking refugee stories and flattening them into a single narrative designed to hammer home a political point, your political point? There is a real risk of sloppy research. And then there's also the publish or perish imperative of modern academia, where contributions are measured in citations. The professionalization of forced migration research over the last 40 years means that it can sometimes feel like it only exists in ever-diminishing circles of specialization, especially if you'd like a job at the end of it all. Now, that is much less true for some areas of study. Lawyers and medics, for instance, have long been able to combine practice and research. We see it right here with the Refugee Law Center. But I was a historian, a political philosopher. So on my own time, I absolutely wanted to continue to be an active supporter of migrants' rights, but I didn't know how that drive could relate to my research, my work, without potentially compromising its integrity. Yet at the same time, I also knew I didn't want to spend the next 4 decades of my career in libraries or talking to seminar rooms full of people who largely already agreed with me. So I spent the next few years trying to figure out what might be a way to fix my increasing professional disillusion. And to fast forward a little, because despite appearances to the contrary thus far, I promise you this story really isn't about me. The answer arrived in September 2020. As the pandemic raged and we fretted about the possibility of a second Trump term, and California wildfire smoke turned the sky outside my San Francisco home black with ash. So black the sun did literally not rise that day. I had the spark of an idea. If political will is a major obstacle to fairer asylum and more justice in our immigration systems, then we need to work to change the public opinion behind that. Or at least to provide some kind of voice to different versions of immigration history, ones that don't ignore past or present injustices. What did that mean? Well, I'm still a researcher, so like all researchers, I started by reading. And among the research papers I found, was one suggesting that when it comes to opening up discussion and encouraging empathetic responses to immigration, museums, and particularly history museums, seem to have a significant, measurable effect. That's when I decided I wanted to create a place where I could tell stories. Carefully researched, complex, nuanced stories about immigration and identity. Stories that could provoke conversations and engender empathy among the vast majority of the public, who are people who don't think about immigration or refugees all that often, but who are still open to the idea that fair immigration and fair asylum policies do matter. I wanted these stories to be more than just journalism. I wanted them to be grounded in research and archives and thoughtful analysis, and to educate as well as entertain. And so that's how, a few years later, and many pitch decks later, I started the California Migration Museum. Today, we like to talk about ourselves as a new kind of museum. We're a museum without walls, a museum that takes history out into neighborhoods where migration stories are still unfolding. And we've created to date 5 free audio experiences that combine narrative storytelling with extended reality technology to make the past visible in places that often can't be easily seen. So it's history on your mobile phone for free. And for me, it's a way of using my research skills alongside storytelling to build something that talks directly to the public, without compromising on quality, and crucially, without having to rely on someone else, usually with a deadline and an editor breathing down their neck, to get the quote right. So before I carry on, I want to show you an example of the kind of work that we do. The video that's about to play is a 2D version of the immersive opening scene from our tour that's set in downtown Los Angeles. And this story, entitled Ni de aquí, ni de allá, neither from here nor from there, begins in a square known as La Placita, which just happens to be the site of the first public mass immigration rate in the United States.
Everybody sit. I said everybody remain seated. Siéntense. Right, you. Show me your papers. Papeles. Now.
On the afternoon of February 26, 1931, immigration officers, working with Los Angeles police, quietly surrounded the plaza you're standing in, carrying out one of the very first public immigration raids in the United States. You can't see any trace of that story now. If you look around the plaza, known as La Placita Obrera, what you see is a riot of color and fun. The atmosphere is festive. That contradiction is at the heart of this story. Which histories do we choose to remember? Which histories are we encouraged to forget? So Ni de aquí, ni de allá focuses on Ni de aquí, ni de allá focuses on the Mexican-American experience of so-called repatriation in the 1930s, when US President Herbert Hoover declared he intended to protect American jobs for real Americans, a sentiment which led to 1 million people of Mexican descent, 60% of whom were US-born and therefore American citizens, being coerced into a return home. Los Angeles was at the forefront of these efforts, both because of the large numbers of Mexican Americans living in the city by the 1930s, and because the city and LAPD leadership were particularly keen to promote nativist policies during this period. Now, just telling this story is important, because until about 20 or 30 years ago, this history had been almost entirely wiped from Los Angeles and California's collective memory. So telling this story publicly is in itself an important corrective to that erasure. But how does a museum like ours go about recreating a largely forgotten history like this? And perhaps more relevant for this talk right now, How does a story like this offer opportunities to take forced migration research out of the academy and use it to build public understanding? In this case, there's actually only a very small body of research work that directly addresses the topic. But luckily, the research that does exist is extremely rich. In the 1970s, a graduate student at Cal State Fullerton, Christine Valenciana, began an oral history project, collecting the testimonies of Mexican Americans who'd been repatriated, but who had then later returned to the US. Her mother was her first interviewee. These audio recordings and their transcripts allowed us to start reconstructing those coerced returns using the words and later in the tour, the actual voices of those who remembered being repatriated. There are a few insights here, I think. First, it's not always the research that's most policy relevant or even most recent that's best placed to speak loudest in any given moment. There are some pretty obvious parallels between the self-deportations of the 1930s and those happening today. But this research wasn't carried out in the shadow of 2025. Nonetheless, it was right there waiting for us when the time came. And I also want to underline this. Christine was a graduate student when she carried out her work. So don't think your MA thesis can't matter, even 50 years later. Second, when it comes to speaking beyond the academy, primary research sources, not just oral history, but also census data or letters in the archives, are enormously powerful. Too often in academic writing, the people in the work are condensed into a few cherry-picked quotes to support an argument or make room for critical analysis. And while there's nothing wrong with this, it's what academic writing is for, and we are all editors of the stories we choose to tell. The fact that Christine's full audio recordings and transcripts are digitized and publicly available made getting inside the story much easier when trying to tell a public history of the 1930 repatriations. It's a reminder that making primary sources and testimonies available is valuable in itself, and I think that is something that researchers can do more of. Of course, research is only the beginning. Over the next year, we crafted the script for Ni de Aquí, Ni de Allá. And I think it's in this process, this story writing, which is where the tensions between academic and imaginative frameworks can sometimes become apparent. A script needs a main character. It needs colorful details and rhythm. And sometimes the pursuit of color can clash with the tendency of academic work to be cautious, to talk in terms of what's certain. But with storytelling, you do sometimes just have to fill in the blanks. What was the weather like? How might the square have sounded on that February day? The challenge as a research-grounded museum is to do so in a way that remains as faithful as possible to the facts we do know. And I think this is where newspaper accounts of major events can be particularly helpful. So in the case of the La Placita raid, we were especially fortunate because one of the 400 Mexican Americans who was caught up in that raid was a photojournalist from the Spanish language newspaper La Opinión, and he happened to have his camera with him. The front page story appeared the next day, although it was all entirely ignored by the English language papers in Los Angeles. But we could use La Opinión's description of the police interrogations and the single photo from the raid as the anchor for our recreation. Then we used other archival images and music to add visual and auditory dimensions to the scene. Now, this is all a way more imaginative process than would be reasonable in a purely academic setting. But it was still tied into our research. And again, we were lucky. Christine and a number of other professors embraced the process. They walked the tour many times. They helped us to figure out what details we could embroider faithfully-ish and what we had to leave to one side. They understood the idea that the essential truth was perhaps more important than the particular truth, especially in telling this story to the public when this story is so relevant to today. So at this point, we had a story crafted largely from research with just a little imaginative editing. But then comes the question of voice. Who should tell the story of the 1930s Mexican-American repatriations. We spend a lot of time thinking about this at the California Migration Museum. And of course, most academic researchers also think deeply about this question. But I think it is fair to say that when you're crafting a public history, this issue of voice redoubles in importance. You need to lift up a community story. You need a main character who's more than just a professor. And this is why we work with storytellers in the community as we script our tours, folding in their own personal history. So it's a collaborative effort. We bring pages of research and facts. The narrator adds a personal touch. In Ni de Aquí Ni de Allá, our narrator is a remarkable woman named Carla Estrada, a former DACA recipient who weaves her own story of more recent family separation through the history of the 1930s. And to understand what she brings to the story, I want to play this extract from the tour, where we hear her reflections on the impact of the 1931 raid.
February 27, 1931, 11 mexicanos presos en un aparatoso raid a la placita. 11 Mexican prisoners taken at a sudden raid at the placita.
In the end, only a few people were actually deported. But this raid's significance couldn't be measured like that. It was the first large-scale public immigration raid the city had seen. Its true purpose was to terrorize the community.
In the hours after it, women roamed the streets, trying to work out where their husbands had gone.
I can imagine how they must have felt. No, I know how they felt. My own family has felt the terror. I came to the United States when I was 5 years old with my parents and my younger brother. Unknowingly, I became one of the 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States. Throughout my childhood, I knew I was illegal. But I never grasped why or the implications of that status. Whispers of silent raids in workplaces during the Obama administration haunted my dreams. As a teenager, my parents created a to-do list in case one or both of them were deported. Eating tacos and dancing in the street can erase the dark reality that many Mexican immigrants live in fear of deportation. I look around and wonder how many in this same plaza at this present time are scared. How many parents wonder if they will be able to see their children grow up here.
It's an emotional moment, and it's intended to be. That's exactly why we need a main character in the way that research papers don't. There's an immediacy there, a human connection. And we hope that our visitors can experience these histories in ways that provoke that emotional as well as an intellectual response, because that is how you build empathy. And personally, after years of being trained to separate the two and to approach my research with a calm and analytical mind, I found something enormously liberating about being also able to engage as a professional with the emotional dynamics of forced migration. So I do think that part of what we offer as a storytelling museum is an opportunity to add the emotion back into the factual analysis without losing historical rigor. Obviously, this is a fine line to tread. One of the greatest fears of academic researchers, and a fear I definitely shared when I was one too, is that too often when they do try and share their work to a broader audience, it ends up skewed or sensationalized. Another fear, again, not unjustified, is that in finding a way to make research appealing and accessible, it loses all its meaning. If we're talking about meaningful ways to make forced migration research flourish in public spaces, because the idea is to change things, we can't just reduce it all down to a pop culture meme or an Instagram reel. And yet in 2025, this is exactly how culture, not to mention news and politics, are consumed. So if the point is to change things, and we believe, as I do, that change won't happen without reaching people first, then ignoring this reality is a fast track to public irrelevance. But in developing the California Migration Museum's platforms over the past year, I've discovered that I think there are ways to use Instagram and TikTok and YouTube in ways that open up the beginnings of longer, deeper conversations. And here's a case in point. Last year, we launched a project called Melting Spots, an immigrant food story of San Francisco, immigrant map of San Francisco food, in fact. Through interviews with 38 restaurateurs and chefs and grocery store owners, we trace the story of how San Francisco's past, from the gold rush through Chinese exclusion and Japanese-American internment to new tech boom arrivals, could be read in the food that the city eats. We worked with artists to commission a map. We recorded hours of tape and then edited the interviews down to 2 to 3 minutes. And we launched a series of linked stories via YouTube. And at first listen, I don't think these seem like particularly research-heavy snippets, clips. This one we're going to listen to now is an interview with a second-generation Palestinian immigrant.
My name is Samir Morgano. I'm the chef, founder, and owner of Beit Rima here in San Francisco. Beit means home, house, or town in Arabic, and Rima is my mother's name. I was born in San Francisco. At one point, while I was living in the Mission, I was able to buy one of those hot dog carts you see on the street. There was actually a couple times where I went out and did Arabic food on the cart, actually. I did kind of like a chicken that was inspired by a dish called msahen, which I'm going to be hopefully actually putting on the menu soon here. So it's kind of full circle. My dad always had restaurants in San Francisco my whole life. He initially had a cafe. Then in 1999, he started Burgermeister, which would be pretty successful for the next 20 years. I guess my dad just wanted to do something that was American, to assimilate. I wanted to change the concept from burgers to Arabic food because I've always dreamt about creating a restaurant that paid homage to my culture, to my family, and to my people, especially after 9/11. I feel that Arab Americans feel they have to hide their identity and their culture. Most Arabic restaurants in America identify as Middle Eastern or even more vaguely Mediterranean. So, for example, when I tell people I have an Arabic restaurant, they're like, oh my God, wow, I've never had Arabic food before. And I say, oh wow, really? You've never had hummus or falafel? And they say, oh, so you mean Mediterranean food. Even when I came to open my restaurant, my dad did not want me to call it Beit Rima. My dad did not want me to call it Arabic comfort food because he was scared that people may have prejudices against an Arabic name and identifying as Arabic. And I told my dad that part of the reason why I'm opening this restaurant is to represent for Arabic culture. So, I stood my ground, and I think today my dad is proud that I have the courage to do it, and I'm proud to represent.
Okay, so what is that story about? It's about hot dogs and harissa, sure. But it's also about so much more than that. It's a story about generational tensions. It's a story about finding ways to belong and figuring out what it means to be proudly Arab American. And that 3-minute clip? Well, in the first week since after we posted it, it was viewed over 13,000 times. And as a whole, Melting Spots reached 250,000 people in the first 2 months after we published the stories. Now, most of those people absolutely came for the food, not the forced migration, but quite a sizable fraction stayed for the podcast that we published following the series, where we took some of those themes like authenticity, fusion, the nature of memory, and discussed these stories through those different, quite academic lenses. So thinking about what's the hook for a piece of research and breaking that down into something more accessible, maybe it's falafel, maybe it's a fashion show, doesn't mean you need to lose sight of a more serious argument. In fact, I would argue, it can be the way to make that argument heard by thousands more. Right, so that's all great. Let's stop and check in here for a moment. How's this making the world a fairer place thing going? It's going great, you know, just great. Who's listening exactly? And why did you think that history mattered, Katy? I mean, you know, if the point's to change things, how exactly does telling stories about what happened a century ago or about hot dogs and harissa help to build a better future when the world is on fire right now? But here's the thing. History isn't just the past. History is also the story we tell ourselves now about who we are and who we want to become. And at a national level, the lies and the omissions in the histories we tell ourselves flatter politicians' consciences and excuse present-day cruelties, whether that's by omitting the story of Mexican-American repatriations from textbooks or talking about a proud history of welcoming refugees when the historical record shows something much more messy. And I think that when we share those different, difficult histories, stories that talk about slavery and genocide and displacement and exclusion, we do ultimately understand more about who we are. There needs to be that truth before there can be forward progress. In the US, this belief that history matters has taken on a new meaning in the past 5 months. I was asked to give this talk in December, and I had no idea that things would look quite like this when I said yes. The US has long had a very problematic relationship with its own history, but Donald Trump and the wider MAGA's new crusade to restore truth and sanity is unusually brazen in its whitewashing. And it's absolutely strategic, because a distorted, manipulated history that doesn't account for immigrants and diversity in its reckoning of America helps excuse the dystopian ambitions of the MAGA movement for the future. So much easier to untether the 14th Amendment from a history in which it never mattered that much in the first place. We forget the past injustices and how much easier it is to repeat them. 6 months ago, maybe that was just an easy truism. It was a motivational Instagram quote. But I think it hits differently now. In fact, right now, I'd argue that telling histories about American immigration that are rooted in research and in the reality of what America is, always a nation of immigrants, but often a nation that has also hated immigrants, is an act of resistance in itself. And my hope is that if enough people hear stories about Chinese exclusion and Wonking Ark or Japanese American incarceration, it becomes just a little easier to see that the whole idea of making America great again isn't visionary. It's just fake nostalgia. So yeah, history matters. It always matters. But right now it's on the front line. And so, at least in the US, is academic freedom. Since taking office, Trump has gutted the National Endowment for Humanities, abolished the National Endowment for the Arts. Universities have lost $8.7 billion in research funding and counting. Harvard is fighting for the right to enroll any international students, and thousands of those international students and researchers have had their visas revoked. Today, it's been 87 days since Columbia student Mahmoud Khalil was detained without a warrant by US immigration, and he has not been charged with any crime. The impact of these detentions and visa revocations has been chilling. Immigrants in the US are scared, and that's the point. So too are academic researchers, especially when they are also immigrants. And that's the point too, especially when they are also immigration researchers. The instinct to keep heads down and to wait this storm out is a powerful one. But I'm lucky, which is another way often of saying I'm privileged. I have an American passport. And given I have no idea, given this funding climate, what the California Migration Museum will look like next year, let alone whether we'll make it to 2028, it feels like the time to speak up is now. You know, I started this by saying that the point for me of doing this work was to try and change the world. And maybe right now the point is simply to keep holding on to the idea research matters and to keep saying that publicly. And while it might be very tempting to chalk this one up to American exceptionalism, I think it's important to recognize that recent events on this island of strangers suggest the political winds here could easily blow in the same direction as they could in so many other parts of the world. It's time for me to wrap up, but for those of you who are convinced of the importance of trying to take your work beyond the lecture hall, I want to end with a few ideas. First, I'd say think beyond an op-ed. Think creatively about what might spark a public conversation about your forced migration research. Maybe it's an art installation, maybe it's music, maybe you dream big and it's a 6-part Netflix drama. The key is, I think, to resist grabbing at quick headlines. Build a public project instead and be patient. If we can be certain of anything while the world is burning, it's that we'll continue to talk of refugee and migration crises for the foreseeable future. But take that talk beyond the academy. Talk to artists and producers and writers and designers and museums. Build those relationships, collaborate, step out of your comfort zone, step out of the lecture hall. Because in the end, that's the way that beyond just disseminating your research to a wider audience, you might just build something extraordinary. Something that doesn't just break down the academy's walls, but changes the whole conversation. Just a little bit. In a way that maybe builds just a little bit more empathy and opens up just a little bit more space for the more just world that I hope we all still might one day get to build. Thank you.